This is Kyle Richards, the creator of the Total Sports Recall logo and owner of Abstract Sports, and you are listening to the Total Sports Recall podcast, a part of the Sports History Network. Now, here's your host, Harv Aronson.
Welcome to Total Sports Recall. I am your host, Harv Aronson, and in this episode, we are going to be talking football, the Cardinals type. That is because my guest is Joe Ziemba, who is recognized as one of the leading authorities on the history of professional football in the country, an award-winning author with such books as When Football Was Football, The Chicago Cardinals and the Birth of the NFL, Cadets, Cannons, and Legends, The Football History of Morgan Park Military Academy, and Bears versus Cardinals, the NFL's oldest rivalry. Joe Ziemba is a lifelong resident of the South Side of Chicago and he first became interested in the history of pro football after discovering that his father was a draft choice of the Chicago, now Arizona, Cardinals, selected in the 1940 NFL Draft as the 131st pick overall in the 15th round. Because of his knowledge of the early days of the professional game, Joe has been a resource for articles or reports in Sports Illustrated, the New York Times, Chicago Magazine, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Daily Southern, the Arizona Republic, NBC Sunday Night Football, CBS Sunday Night Football, ESPN, and many others. Joe has appeared on the WGN documentary Football in Chicago, a Comcast sports special on the Chicago Bears on radio stations such as WBBM and WSCR in Chicago, as well as the Global Sports Broadcasting Network. Joe hosts When Football Was Football, the podcast on Sports History Network, which subsequently was one of the 8 global finalists in both 2022 and 2023 for the Football Podcast of the Year. Joe is a frequent guest on numerous pro football podcasts and was recently a speaker at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, on the origins of the National Football League as the NFL celebrated its belated 100th anniversary. In 2022, Joe was the recipient of the prestigious Ralph Hay Award presented by the Professional Football Researchers Association for Lifetime Achievement in Pro Football Research and Historiography. This year, Joe's book, Bears versus Cardinals, was awarded the Certificate of Excellence from Illinois State Historical Society in that organization's annual Best of Illinois History Awards. Joe Ziemba is also the author of When Football Was Football, The Chicago Cardinals, and the Birth of the NFL, making him the world's leading and only Chicago Cardinals historian. This according to Chicago Magazine, which was written in October 2022. Joe, welcome to the show, and that introduction convinces me you know a lot about the Cardinals, probably more than I know of my beloved Steelers.
Oh, thank you, Harv. It's so great to be with you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and that introduction simply means I have no life. I find more fun looking in dusty microfilm and old books about old football. My wife, thankfully, is very, very understanding. But thanks so much for having me on the show today.
Total Sports Recall is sponsored by Mira Artistry, where you can purchase beautiful fine art photography and abstract art. Contact Mira Artistry in regards to commissions and availability of the pieces on her site. She would like to create something special for you. For the photography and art lovers in your life, Mira Artistry has the perfect gifts for you. Visit Mira Artistry at www.miraartistry.com. That's MERAARTISTRY.com. MiraArtistry.com. Well, I'm a history buff myself, so anytime I can talk history of football or any other sport, it's a pleasure. So let's begin with your father. Joe Ziemba was, in fact, drafted by the Chicago Cardinals in 1940, and he played end. In 2009, his alma mater, Benedictine College, placed him in their Athletic Hall of Fame. Benedictine's mascot is a raven, and your father was also named to the first team All-CIC as an end in 1939. What more can you tell us about your father, and what has he told you about being a Raven football player at Benedictine College?
Well, they were going down to Benedictine, which at that time was called St. Benedict's in the 1930s. Here's a guy from the south side of Chicago, and St. Benedict's had a reputation as a really good football program. In fact, they were called the Notre Dame of the West. And the reason for that was a lot of players from the Chicago Catholic League high schools went to Notre Dame or they went to St. Benedict's back then. But he had a great career. Besides being all-conference, he was named a Little All-American. Even though it was a smaller school, St. Benedict's, they played Creighton, I believe, Wichita State, New Mexico State. as well as other local schools. So the thing about him is he never really talked about it. I knew this big guy who was about 6'5" and maybe 260 in his adult life. Never really talked about it. So it was kind of neat, but I would go to different functions. I remember with him as a kid, and people would recognize him and call him by his nickname of Zeke, or he had other nicknames as well. Everyone seemed to know him because he, as you mentioned, got drafted by the Cardinals and re-injured his knee in training camp. And while in the hospital, he decided that, this isn't for me. I don't want to undergo the knife, which today would have been a simple arthroscopic surgery. But he decided he could make more money coaching high school football than he could playing professional football in the 40s. But it was kind of interesting, as I mentioned, he didn't talk too much about his career. And it wasn't until long after he'd passed away, I had this box of stuff. And we all have boxes of stuff that we carry around when we move. And the box I had from him had his contract from the Cardinals, which paid him the lofty sum of $110 a game. But he had to bring his own shoes and shoulder pads at training camp. That was the NFL in the 40s. And he had letters from George Halas and from the Lions. Even though the draft had been instituted a few years earlier, the key thing that the NFL teams were offering was not only a contract to play football, but also the opportunity of jobs off the field. Players then had to work other jobs just to make ends meet way back when. So it was kind of neat, and that got me started on my research. I wanted to find out what really happened to him. Would he have made the team? And what was very positive about it is finding stuff through the years and nothing. When I say positive, I found an answer in 1997. Finally, the Cardinals had their 50th reunion after winning the 47 title, and I met a lanky end, Billy Duell, and he was asking why I was there, and I said, well, just doing research on my dad, and I've been working on a book on the Cardinals because I wanted to find out more about the Cardinals too. But anyway, he described my dad being at training camp and said, yeah, he got hurt. I remember that. And he really would have helped us. And so that made my journey through research so wonderful to find that out, that someone remembered him after all those years. So that's kind of how I got where I'm in. I wanted to find out more about his career, what happened, and did locate a little NFL yearbook where he was listed as one of the final 32 on the Cardinals back then. But so his name is in there, but he apparently thought, this is not the life for me. So that's how I got here in the terms of starting the research.
That's really neat. Have you saved all those artifacts you found?
I have, yeah. Do have a lot of interesting things, the little booklets and articles. Of course, now research is so much easier, as you know. You used to have to go in, as I mentioned, look at microfilm and hope and pray as you go through each page slowly. Now you can just key in a letter and go online and find out. And I found out a lot more stuff about him because I never had individual game reports of games he played in. So that was quite helpful as well.
Oh, that's so neat. And given the stature of George Halas, I'm sure that letter is worth some money there.
I wonder, in fact, I can kind of look at it right now as we're talking. I have it on my shelf because who would believe George Halas would write this guy?
That's amazing. I mean, you definitely, he's like the godfather of football. He has so much history to him. So, I'd like to see that. If you ever get a chance, I would love to see a copy of that.
Absolutely.
I thrive on historical stuff, and that would be so neat to see something like that again, given who George Halas was. So some NFL teams, they change cities sometimes. Cleveland Browns went to Baltimore. Baltimore moved from Baltimore to Indianapolis, Houston to Tennessee, just to name a few. The Cardinals, too, have moved several times, but they retained their nickname where other teams took on new nicknames. So the Cardinals began in Chicago, moved to St. Louis, finally to Arizona, but not before taking on the name Phoenix Cardinals. What's your feeling about all that movement?
Yeah, it's interesting how they could stay in one spot here in Chicago. The team actually began in 1899 and stuck around until 1960. That's a long, long time. But the team never really was financially flush, I guess you would say. And so as the economics of the league changed, kind of parallel to the birth of television for the NFL, Cardinals went after greener pastures. At the time, in 1960, Chicago was the only city that had two NFL teams, and so they had something called the blackout rule. Us old timers may remember that. If you wanted to watch your favorite team in Chicago and the other team was at home or the other was on the road, they wouldn't televise one of the teams because they didn't want to hurt attendance. So that was interesting. And when the Cardinals left, that allowed the Bears and our friend George Halas to control the whole market. And of course, when the Cardinals left back then in 1960, Halas personally, apparently, or the team donated $500,000 to the Cardinals for moving expenses, which is big bucks back then, if you look 63 years ago. And again, when the Cardinals were in St. Louis, there was a search for a stadium, which never really happened. And then finally the move over to Arizona, picking up the Phoenix name and then expanding it to the Arizona, which is similar to when the Cardinals back in 1920, I'm going way back here, they were called the Racine Cardinals, named after a street in Chicago. And in 1920, Chris O'Brien, who was the managing the team and eventually really owned it, thought, hey, I can get a bigger market here if I call them the Chicago Cardinals, which is what he did. So through the years, we have seen changes based on the market as well as now the economics of the television and the money that brings in for all the teams.
Sure. And speaking of the blackout rule, I've repeated the story several times, but in 1972, the blackout rule caused the Oakland Raiders Steelers game not to be televised in Pittsburgh. So obviously that's the Immaculate Reception game. I had to listen to that on the radio. I was not able to see it, and not until replays came around did I ever get to see the play. And my father was actually at the game, and so he got to see it up close and personal. But for me, 12 years old, I had to listen to it on the radio. So, yeah, that blackout rule was something else. And then talking about the Cardinals these days, I just had to throw it out there that unfortunately the Steelers lost to the 2-10 Cardinals a couple of weeks ago on their home field, and then turn around and I don't know if you were aware of this or you heard it, but then this past Thursday they lost to New England, who was also a 2-win team. The Steelers became the first team in NFL history to lose to two teams back to back that were at least 8 games under 500 while they were above 500. So they set some history there, and oh my gosh, they're a mess right now. But anyway,
yes. I was able to see that second game, and of course the rain, and I think that was the rain game, wasn't it?
That was the Arizona game. Yeah, that was Arizona game.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, that hurts. I mean, when you think of the Bears this year and being in Chicago, not having a lot of success, and then 3 or 4 weeks ago having a big lead over Detroit going into the last couple of minutes and still managed to lose. So does that hurt more, or does it hurt more to losing to 2-10 teams? I think they all hurt.
Oh no, I'm telling you, Mike Tomlin there's been talk about replacing him over the years, but now this is like the biggest buzz around Steelers Nation is that his time has come. And so I think that's the last 4 games of the season are going to determine his future for sure. So we'll see what happens, but there's a lot of talk about getting rid of him finally and moving on to something else, but we'll see what happens. So let's get back to the Cardinals. Many Steeler fans know about the team they had in 1943 because of World War II and the player shortage. They and the Philadelphia Eagles combined roster to become the Steagles. But in 1944, a year later, still facing player shortages, the Steelers and the Cardinals pulled the same trick and became known as the Pit Cards. However, that team was not very good. They finished the season without winning a game, 0-10 overall, coached by Phil Handler and Walt Kiesling from the Eagles and from the Cardinals and the Steelers, respectively. The team scored more than 10 points only 3 times and were held under 7 points 3 times. What are your thoughts about that 1944 season? Because I do know you know about it.
Yeah, well, I love talking about that topic with the Card Pits. Were so bad, 0-10. And not only did they have a very bad offense, I think they went through 6 quarterbacks. None of them could pass. And they only had a lead in a game, I believe, 3 times all season. They actually did win a game, though. They won an exhibition game that took place after their second or third league game. And so we can say, well, they did have some promise. But you'd have guys that were being called off to the service or those who got injured. So many little stories there. But I guess my favorite is, as you mentioned, they were called the Card Pits. And they were so bad and lost for so long that season. Eventually, they were called the Carpets. And why not? Everyone
Oh,
walked
no.
all over the carpet. So I truly believe this was the worst team in NFL history. That would be a book topic, I think, in the future sometime. And they even had one significant thing that happened that wasn't really good was Johnny Grigas, who was a running back for the team, was actually at the top, first or second in rushing, going for the rushing title. And then he didn't show up for the last game or so. And the reason was he was burned out mentally at the time. People just didn't understand that. But eventually, within 60 days or so, people were saying, well, this guy had a cry for help. And we never listened to how the players feel. He was working full time in a factory supporting the war effort, on his feet all day. And then he would go practice. And as he said one time, that he was just really tired of getting knocked down behind that bad line and hitting that frozen ground. But the NFL, after that, looking into it, said, we got to do stuff for the physical as well as the emotional part of the game for the players. And so I think that was a significant result of Johnny departing from the team. And he had a great season going and was never able to duplicate that. But it also shows that the effect losing has on a player.
Yeah, that would be an interesting book. Worst team of all time in the NFL, because you could consider the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think it was 76, their first year in the league. They never won a game. You've got the winless Detroit Lions, and then you got the winless Cleveland Browns. So there's 4 teams that you could all throw in there in the mix and see which one was the worst of all time.
Yes. And ironically, before I think it was that season or the year before, the Bears and the Cardinals thought maybe they could merge. And that was thrown out by the league. Yeah, it was in 43. And the league owner said, no, one team like that would be too powerful. And of course, then they decided to let the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh merge, which had a fairly successful team. They were over 500. And I think there was some talk the next year, the Bears and Cardinals getting together. And they said, no, too powerful a team. So.
Yeah, and the Steagles name is just, for those who are historians of Steelers football or know football history, they'll recognize that Steagles right away. And I mean, I've actually seen jerseys and hats, out there in public of the Steagles. So it kind of stuck even after they only had the one season. So the Cardinals retired the following jersey numbers: Larry Wilson's number 8. Naturally, Pat Tillman in his number 40, Stan Malden, 77, J.V. Caines, 88, and Marshall Goldberg, who wore number 99. Any players that are not in that group I just mentioned that you feel are deserving or should have their number retired one day?
Yeah, there's so many good ones that played throughout the years. I think for one would have been Patty Driscoll from the 20s, but we're not really sure what number he wore. I believe it was number 1. He would have been a good one. Duke Slater, the great lineman, played several years for the Cardinals. Finally made it into the Hall of Fame after 80 years of waiting.
Wow,
he would have been a great one for the front line. And then I think of Pat Harter. Pat Harter was the NFL's MVP in the late 40s for the Cardinals. Led the league in scoring, I think, 3 times. A fullback for the Cardinals. Played both ways. Was their kicker. He's another one who I think is very underrated in Cardinals history. So Pat Harter might have been one as well. My expertise or lack of it is before the face mask era, before 1960. So there's other players throughout time in the Cardinals as well that might have been deserving of this. Some teams, like the Bears, retire quite a bit, although they stopped retiring numbers after Ditka a few years ago. They were running out of numbers, I think. So it's interesting to see how these were selected. But those are just, they're all good ones. Stan Malden, who passed away in the locker room and in the Cardinals game in, I think, 48. And, of course, Tillman we know about. And J.V. Cain also was passed away after, I think, a preseason practice. But Marshall Goldberg's an interesting one because he at one time led the league in 5 different categories in the early 40s. Went in the service, All-American at Pitt, played offense and defense. And then in 47, when they won the title, he switched primarily to defense. As probably one of the first defensive specialists, if not the first defensive specialist in the National Football League. So all these gentlemen are well deserving, but there's still a couple other ones lurking out there that I think might be recognized one day. If it happens, I don't know.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that if the Cardinals are still considering retiring any more numbers down the road. And Marshall Goldberg, I thought that name, I know who he is, but I thought it had some kind of Pittsburgh connection, and I had forgotten or didn't realize that he played for the University of Pittsburgh, my hometown. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's kind of neat. Uh, well, we were just talking about the Cardinals this year. Last season they finished 4-13. This year they're now 3-10. In 2021, they had a solid record of 11-6, but before that, there was a string of 5 straight seasons with a losing record or finishing at even 500. Aside from beating my Steelers, what's it going to take the Arizona Cardinals to get back to contender status?
Oh boy, a tough one. I always have discussions with guys like yourself or people like yourself that talk about, do you build through the draft? Do you build through trades? We've seen how the college football landscape has changed dramatically with this transfer portal. My goodness, that thing is just going nuts. So in college, I think a lot of teams say, let's get the best quarterback available. So I think it starts there. Unfortunately, that's the way the NFL is going, looking for a mobile quarterback who can run as well as pass. And so Cardinals have Kyler Murray just back from a severe knee injury and surgery, looking pretty good, I guess, in my opinion. Is he the one? Or since the draft pick will be quite high this year, do they go for one of the hot shots coming out of college this year? But And on the other hand, in Chicago, we have a very mobile quarterback just back from injury in Justin Fields. But sometimes the line is very porous, and that poor guy is really literally running for his life. So if your offense is going to be successful, can the quarterback be successful if he has to rush every throw or have to run when he doesn't want to? And it's an age-old thing in discussing the NFL, but I don't think it'll ever go away. And those teams that are successful, I'm thinking the Chiefs a couple of years ago, kind of revamped their entire offensive line. Now, on the other hand, we got the Bears over the centuries that have been prided themselves on the defense. You guys got Butkus and Singletary and Urlacher that seem to keep the other team off guard and keep them out of the end zone. But going back to your question for the Cardinals, I think building that offense and making everyone comfortable with it. I like what the coaching staff is doing now. It seems like they're going in the right direction. Perhaps build a couple of pieces. You look at Marvin Harrison coming out. Do you take him or a quarterback after seeing those guys playing for some of these teams? So I guess perhaps building the offensive line and then making sure your defense is at least able to stop the opponent once in a while.
Yeah, and in Pittsburgh, it's interesting because I'm asking about the future. My next question was asking the future about Kyler Murray, but a lot of Pittsburgh Steelers fans are not really happy with Kenny Pickett. He's injured now. He's out for 3 or 4 weeks. He's shown some promise, but he's not. We don't think he's like the franchise type quarterback. And then, of course, Mitch Trubisky filling in for him had a terrible game the other night against New England. He's just awful. I mean, he had his shot in Chicago. He was a backup in Buffalo, but he's not the future either. So now there's a buzz about what about getting Justin Fields in Pittsburgh? And then I've also heard the name Kyler Murray, trying to get him over to the Steelers. So Steelers quarterback situation, I mean, their offense is just pathetic. And it's a shame because, like you're talking about Chicago having a history of defense, that's the Steelers' history as well. Always had solid defenses. And I think the defense right now is just fantastic. But they're being brought down by their lack of an offense. So what do you think the chances are Kyler Murray may be switching teams?
That could be. We hear those things. I'm even here in Chicago about Justin Fields. People say, well, maybe he's headed for Atlanta or some other team, and you can get several good players for a quarterback that's still young and promising. Yeah, the age-old question, though, do you keep it? And I think of the Cardinals drafted Rosen, I believe it was, out of UCLA, and then quickly got
Josh
Murray.
Rosen.
Now do they change again? And the Bears thought Trubisky was the guy, then got Fields. Now do they go to Caleb Williams out of USC, or is his stock dropped? recently, but you get these really good quarterbacks. You wonder where they're going to end up and who's going to pull the trigger. And then we have so much social media pressure, I think, on the front office and the
Sure.
team now that whatever you do, it could be wrong in a couple of years. I told you so.
Sure.
So hindsight is wonderful. I think every coach or general manager wishes he could look into hindsight and say, yep, I know this is going to happen, so I won't do it. But that's never going to occur in the NFL.
Yeah, and in Pittsburgh with the Rooneys, they're stubborn. They like to stay with continuity, and we only had 3 coaches in 1969. But at the game Thursday night with Trubisky playing horrible, there were chants in the stands for Mason, Rudolph. They wanted the third stringer to come in and play quarterback.
Right, yes.
And I actually thought he should have started the game. They had nothing to lose. Their offense was terrible. And so I really feel bad for Mason Rudolph because I actually think he's better than Mitch Trubisky. And meanwhile, Mike Tomlin said he had no plans of replacing Mitch Trubisky, even though he threw a bad interception that led to a score. So you can never tell with these coaches and owners. But you're talking about social media, and the Steelers are just screaming bloody murder that they want change. They're tired of, this poor play on offense. And so it'll be interesting to see how Art Rooney handles the public pressure once the season concludes and where we end up.
Yeah, because I think the Steelers got a nice foundation there, and I'm just thinking, because I had not thought of that before, of having Kyler Murray or Justin Fields back there could really change the complexion of the team for the better. Having a quarterback who can throw and run especially would really add and bring some instant offense.
Mm-hmm. And you could see the frustration on the offensive players, with George Pickens is constantly showing frustration because he believes the offense should be better than it is, and it should be. They've got some really talented players on offense, so it's unfortunate. But we're here to talk Cardinals. So the Cardinals, they placed 23 players in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And do you anticipate any more players that have not yet been voted in but will?
Yeah, no, good question. I haven't thought about that too much. Of course, the pro football history's got such a logjam of not only the players who are newly eligible, but those who have been waiting around for decades. And I look at the example of Duke Slater, how long he waited. Pat Harter is a guy I definitely think should be considered for the Hall of Fame. And we discussed Marshall Goldberg, who made it to the senior finals, I think in 2008 or so, and still didn't get in. People might say, well, I look at the statistics of those guys when the game was completely different 70 or 80 years ago, and they ran most of the time and didn't go for much yardage. There were no spectacular long passing plays. Well, there were some, of course, but those are a couple of guys, at least from pre-1960 when they were in the Chicago Cardinals. Those two guys, I think, might get some consideration. There's also a great lineman named Chet Bulger. Came to the Cardinals. He was in the service and was all-pro, but not all-pro for many years, but still an all-pro. He and Vince Bononis were kind of the anchors of the line. And even going back to the 30s, there was a guy named Gus Tinsley who set all sorts of receiving records and then just walked away from the game. He wasn't getting paid enough, and he became a guy who trained horses. So those are some, but I think at the top list would be Pat Harter. That might be consideration from the old Cardinals for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, we had this conversation before talking about the same topic, and I brought up the name Conrad Dobler and whether or not he could be considered for the Hall of Fame, maybe for being the dirtiest player ever in the NFL. But what are the chances of Conrad, the biter, the mad biter?
I just love talking about Conrad Dobler and other guys like Dick Butkus, and you hear the stories about what happened under the pile of players. Are they biting fingers, as you said? But when that Dobler, was a very solid player for a long, long time, and we didn't have great measuring sticks for linemen way back when. Not even going back that far, but now we can watch them and grade them in the pancake statistic, et cetera, if you're on offense, but defense on how many sacks. but we don't really have film going way, way back of some of the players. There's a guy in the Hall of Fame named Walt Kiesling from the 20s who also coached, as we mentioned, the Card Pits. But there are some wonderful stories about Walt Kiesling and how he would manhandle players in the pile. But always fun stories.
I thought he was
about.
just a coach. I had no idea he was a player as well.
Great player and a sturdy guy, too. He was over 200 pounds back when that was a little unusual. So, I think Dobler should be one that might get some consideration in the future.
Wow, you learn something new every day. I had no idea Walt Kiesling was a football player. I thought he was just a coach. Well, aside from the NFL Cardinals, are you a fan of teams from any other sport? And if so, which teams?
Oh, yes, I like Chicago teams. I do like the Chicago White Sox. We have a little allegiance on the south side of Chicago where I'm at and have grown up. Back when the Cardinals were still here, the Northsiders liked the Cardinals in football. Southsiders like the Cardinals, Northsiders like the Bears. And that's the same now, I think, a little bit with the White Sox and the Cubs, though not as intense. There's still a city series every year. People don't seem to get so wound up. It's almost like it's another league game now. But, I do follow the White Sox and, of course, have that eternal hope that there will be some victories in the future. They've been hard to come by last year with over 100 losses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've had some great players in the past, so the White Sox did. And we could name a bunch of those. But let's go back to football. And who are and have been your favorite players in football?
Oh, well, my best is Butkus. In fact, I do some talks, and that question came up just this week. And without hesitation, I just remember Butkus when I was a much younger man and watching him play in his intensity, and now understanding as I get older how difficult it is to play on bad knees. And we'd see films of him now hobbling, but I loved watching Butkus play. It's one of those guys I wish, he had to retire. I wish he could have kept playing. But Dick Butkus, because he was from the south side of Chicago, went to Chicago Vocational High School and University of Illinois. And just like that shaved head and that grimace and growl on him. So it's he was my favorite player of all time.
Yeah, and our Steelers have a cut from his mold and Jack Lambert. They're very similar.
Oh, yes.
Bucker was just a little bigger of a player, but same intensity, same mentality. Both guys, so much fun to watch.
Yes.
So our two teams played in Super Bowl 43, of which I was lucky enough to attend. When Larry Fitzgerald scored his touchdown late in the game, my heart sank. I thought we were done. But as we all know, Ben Roethlisberger and Santonio Holmes made an incredible comeback to win it for Pittsburgh. And what were your thoughts on that Super Bowl?
Oh, yeah. Boy, it's been so long. And at that time, a few of the Cardinals were still around. I had talked to a couple of them. They were so excited for the team. For example, Charlie Trippy said, I'll be watching. And he was in his 90s then. And when that pass came, if I look across the room, I can still see Holmes kind of crowding that sideline up in the air, grabbing that ball. Oh, no. But maybe next year. Next year never happened. But, that one still punctuated my soul, that reception.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that was one of the greatest catches I've ever seen in any Super Bowl. But unfortunately, I was at the opposite end of the stadium, so I didn't get to see it, except watching it on the Jumbotron. But, you're watching the Jumbotron, so you know when it happened. And, oh, my gosh, the Cardinal fans behind us were, just berating us when Fitzgerald scored. They thought the game was over. And we're sitting with our heads down, shaking, my head's in my hands, going, oh, God, I can't believe it. And then 2 minutes to go, that drive was just amazing. And I remember clearly Santonio Holmes saying to Ben Roethlisberger in the huddle, he goes, let me be the man. Make me the man. Whoa. I want to win this for us. And sure enough, most of the plays went to him in that final series, and what a finish. But you got to give hats off to Cardinals. I mean, they played a great game, and they had a great season. And who knows, maybe one day they will get back there. Yeah. We're still wondering when the Steelers are ever going to get back there as well. So right now,
it's not easy.
That's a distant thought. Well, Joe, it's been a great conversation with Joe. And as I always do, I grant my guests a final opportunity to address our listeners, but also tell us about any projects you're working on and where anyone can find you on the internet or using social media.
Yeah, thank you so much for that opportunity. It was wonderful talking to you, and I enjoy doing a podcast on the Sports History Network. Just look that up on your computer, and it's called When Football Was Football, also the name of my first book on the Cardinals. And we're also on Twitter at Card Chicago, I believe it's called, or Chicago Cards, I'm sorry. But no, Card Chicago. I should get that straight, shouldn't I? So we do stuff on football before Face Mask, and on the podcast we cover all sorts of football in Chicago, mostly Cardinals and Bears, but done some college and even done a couple of high school things and as we've gone through it. But it's a lot of fun to put those together, the little bit of research, you know. Of course, I always mention my little book that came out about a year ago, Bears versus Cardinals, the NFL's oldest rivalry, because it drives me nuts when I turn on a Bears-Packers game and they say the Bears and the Packers are the oldest rivalry. But Packers didn't join the league till a year after the Cardinals and Bears played. But so that's it. But thank you so much for allowing me on the program. And what an enjoyable time talking all sorts of football and baseball with you today. Thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. And anybody that is a history buff should definitely check out your books and your podcast because you never know what you might find out that you didn't know before. And there were several things today that I learned that I had no idea about. And I would not have known those things or ever found out about them unless I had a conversation with you, Joe. So I really strongly recommend our listeners to check out your books, especially for those who love history, as well as your podcast. I encourage them to go listen because, like I said, you might learn something new about football.
Oh, yes. And it's always fun. There'll be a couple of new projects coming out, which I have not able to announce yet, but we're going to go even deeper into the history of pro football with those.
Excellent. Well, when you find out those projects, you're ready to announce them, you let me know, and they will be broadcast on my podcast for sure.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you again. That's very generous of you. Appreciate it, Harv.
Well, this has been another fine interview on Total Sports Recall. And for Joe Ziemba, this is your host, Harv Aronson, letting you know that if you have any comments about this show or suggestions for Total Sports Recall, they can be addressed to the show email at totalsportsrecall@gmail.com. You can reach out to me on my Twitter page using my handle at TSRHarv59. And be sure to visit both my website at www.totalsportsrecall.com and the YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@totalsportsrecall59. If you're interested in purchasing any Total Sports Recall products such as hats, shirts, or coffee mugs, be sure to visit the Sports History Network store, which you can find other products from other podcasts as well. And you can find that online for mine using the URL location of www.shopsportshistory.com/collections. On behalf of Joe Ziemba, this is Harv Aronson wishing everyone a great week ahead.
The contents of this podcast do not represent the opinions of others and are solely the opinions of Harv Aronson based on his experience, knowledge, and research.